Welcome back to the deep dive. I actually want to start today with a bit of a mental exercise.
Yeah.
It's going to be a little uncomfortable, so just bear with me here. I want you to visualize the person who frustrates you the absolute most. Maybe it's that coworker who leaves the break room looking like a disaster zone, or maybe it's the really aggressive driver who cut you off this morning.
Hey,
Or
maybe a politician who seems to be living in a completely different reality than you.
exactly. Got them in your head.
Oh, I think everyone has a list like that ready to go. I definitely do.
Right. So here is the jagged pill we have to swallow today.
Hmm.
What if those people aren't just annoyances? What if they're actually mirrors?
Oof. That is a heavy concept to drop right at the top of the show.
It is, yeah. But it's really the only way to get into the mind of the subject we're covering today. We are diving into the work of Leon Dantes and his whole project, which is called The Resilient Philosopher. Now, we've gone through a huge stack of his audio essays, transcripts, blog posts, and I have to say right up front, this is not your typical ivory tower philosophy.
No, not at all.
It feels incredibly gritty.
Yeah, I've heard it described as philosophy with dirt under its fingernails, which fits perfectly. Dantes blends these very high-level existential questions, stuff like, who am I, what is justice, with incredibly blue-collar experiences. We're talking about lessons that he actually learned out on noisy factory floors or construction sites or sitting in the driver's seat of a truck.
Which I love, because usually philosophy feels so detached from real life. But our mission today is to unpack this core worldview he's building. It sits right at this fascinating intersection of servant leadership, emotional intelligence, and something he calls radical personal accountability.
And he anchors all of this in a catchphrase that sounds really simple, maybe even a little cliche at first glance. He calls it showing up for yourself.
Yeah, let's pause on that real quick, because usually when I hear somebody say show up for yourself, I think of, self-care. I think of taking a bubble bath or setting boundaries so I can stay in and watch movies.
Right. And Dantes would probably say that's fine, but that is not the work. For him, showing up for yourself is entirely about the mirror. It's the idea of reflection versus projection. It's actually quite a confrontational idea.
Totally. To illustrate this, we have to talk about the factory floor story. Because this was the moment in the research where I realized, okay, this guy isn't just venting about his life. He is intensely analyzing human nature.
It's such a great case study. So Dantes talks about working these manufacturing shifts. It's high pressure. There's loud machinery everywhere. And apparently there was this constant low-level war going on between the different shifts.
The classic day shift versus night shift beef.
Exactly. The current shift would come in, look at a machine that wasn't calibrated right, or they'd see a pile of scrap metal left on the floor. And immediately the refrain was, oh, that was the previous shift. They're lazy. They don't know what they're doing. Look what they left for us.
It's always them. Always someone else's fault.
Always them. And Dantes points out that doing this is psychologically safe. If the mess belongs to them, you don't have to fix it. And more importantly, you don't have to ask if you are part of the problem. It completely protects the ego.
But then comes the twist, and I love this part so much. Dante starts actually tracking the workflow on the floor.
Right. He realizes, and eventually he has to point this out to his team, that the mistakes they were constantly complaining about were actually their own. They were literally looking at their own output from the previous cycle or looking at a mess they had ignored yesterday because they figured the next shift would handle it.
So they were standing there yelling at their own reflection.
Precisely. And that right there is the core of his concept, which he calls reflect before you project. He argues that we have this deep instinct to project blame because it's easy. But the hidden labor of leadership, and honestly, just being a decent human being, is looking in the mirror first. If you don't recognize your own mess, you are doomed to keep fighting a ghost.
Wow. And he takes this idea of the mirror and applies it to something way more common than factory work. He talks about road rage. And this story really hit home for me because I am totally guilty of this.
Oh, I think we all are.
He describes being late, he's stressed, his blood pressure is spiking, he gets stuck behind this incredibly slow car, he's honking, he's furious, he's projecting all this utter incompetence onto the driver, like, you idiot, move over.
In his mind, that driver is just the villain of his entire day.
Right, and then he finally passes the car. He looks over, getting ready to give the ultimate death stare, and he sees that it's a 70-year-old man gripping the steering wheel with both hands, looking absolutely terrified.
And all that anger just evaporates.
Instantly. It just turns into shame. But here's what I found really fascinating about Dantes' take on this. Most people would tell that story and say, well, the moral is to be nicer to old people because you don't know their struggle.
True. But Dantes goes a layer deeper than that. He connects it to systems. He says systems like traffic or workplaces or the economy, they eventually replace us. He realized that if he is lucky enough to live that long, he will eventually be that slow elder.
That was the huge aha moment for me. The mirror isn't just reflecting who you are right now in this moment. It's reflecting who you are going to become.
Exactly. And if you're aggressive and impatient with the system now, if you contribute to a culture that hates slowness or hates weakness, you are essentially attacking your future self.
You're building the exact machine that's going to crush you later on.
That's it. And this is where the emotional intelligence piece comes in. Dantes talks about the pause, that tiny gap between the trigger, which is the slow car, and the reaction. That pause is where you get to choose whether to project anger or reflect on your shared humanity.
It's seeing yourself in the other person, even if that version of you is 40 years away. Now, this naturally flows into how he views leadership. Because if you're always looking in the mirror, you can't really be the arrogant, unapproachable boss.
Well, you can, but you definitely wouldn't be a resilient philosopher. And that brings us to his specific take on servant leadership.
Okay, I have to be completely honest here. The term servant leadership has always bugged me just a little bit. It sounds, I don't know, soft, or like you're supposed to be a doormat for your employees.
You aren't alone there. Dantes actually references an anecdote where a friend told him that the word servant sounds like belittling oneself, like you have absolutely no self-respect.
So how does he get around that baggage?
He redefines it. He pushes back hard and calls it stewardship.
Stewardship. Okay, that feels very different.
It does. He argues that bad leaders hoard power. They sabotage promotions because they're terrified of being replaced. They breed competition among their team because it keeps them safely on top. They are stewards of their own ego.
And he shares a really specific example of this from his own life that was pretty surprising to read. He talked about willingly stepping down from a leadership role.
Yes. He had a team that he had trained so well, they basically became entirely self-sufficient. They simply didn't need him to fix everything anymore. And instead of inventing new problems so he could swoop in and look like the hero, which, let's face it, a lot of managers do, he stepped aside.
That is incredibly rare. I mean, how many people do you know who would essentially fire themselves because their team's doing too good of a job?
Not many at all. But that's his lead to serve philosophy in action. He genuinely valued the team's success over holding on to his own title. And he scales this up to a societal level, too. There is this quote he uses regarding leadership in society that really stood out. He says, "If they did it to me, they'll do it to you."
Oh, that's a chilling line. What exact context does he use that in?
He uses it to discuss how divisive leadership works. When leaders protect a chosen few at the expense of the many, or when they constantly use us versus them rhetoric to rally a base, they aren't serving. They are just manipulating.
And if you cheer for them when they attack them, eventually the target moves and it lands on you.
Precisely. And here is where it gets really interesting, because Dantes doesn't just point fingers at bad leaders out there in the world. He takes the mirror and points it right back at himself again. He talks about the Columbine shooting and the whole debate around school safety.
There's a pretty heavy pivot, but I think it's crucial to understanding his point on honesty. He talks about that deep fear of the midnight phone call that every single parent dreads.
Right. And he admits quite openly that this fear biases him. He says he inherently tends to favor strict safety protocols and regulations simply because he has children.
But wait, wouldn't some say that's just taking a political stance?
See, that's the nuance of his approach. He isn't necessarily telling the listener, you must vote for this specific gun control policy. He's saying, look, I am not neutral on this. My experience as a parent heavily shapes my view. He's arguing that true leadership isn't pretending to be perfectly objective. It's admitting your bias out loud so you can actually have an honest conversation.
That is so refreshing. Usually, people just shout their opinions and frame them as absolute facts. But he's saying, here is my bias, here's exactly why I have it. It lowers the temperature of the room immediately.
It really does. And speaking of how we communicate, we absolutely need to talk about his deep dive into language. Because for Dantes, words aren't just tools we use to get things done. He calls them architects of reality.
This segment really touched me. He tells this story called The Power of a Hello. It starts with him as a young kid dreaming of becoming a pilot.
Aviation was his absolute biggest dream.
But he never even tried. And not because he failed a test or couldn't learn the math, but because of silence. He talks about the withholding of encouragement.
Yeah, this connects to what he calls the pattern recognition of failure. If a kid never hears the words, "you can do this," or if they mention a big dream and the adults in the room just meet it with silence, the kid internalizes that silence as a firm no.
It's this heartbreaking idea that silence can be just as destructive as an outright insult. It's a heavy thing to realize that just by saying nothing, you might be actively crushing someone's potential. But then he flips it to actual words and how words can be used to erase people. He brings up the whole Bad Bunny controversy.
The Super Bowl halftime show, right?
Yeah. Bad Bunny is singing in Spanish. He's basically the biggest artist in the entire world, and the internet completely melts down. People are posting things like, "This is America, speak English," or saying that his language simply doesn't belong here.
Dantes uses this moment to pivot to a broader cultural critique, and it is deeply personal for him. He brings up his own Puerto Rican heritage. He talks about family members who are veterans, who proudly served under the U.S. flag, who bled for the country, but whose native language is continually treated as foreign or lesser.
He uses the word erasure.
Yes, erasure. He argues that language is where memory lives. When you tell someone their language doesn't belong, you aren't just critiquing a pop song. You're trying to erase their history. You are essentially telling them they do not exist in the main narrative of the country.
And he connects this right back to his time working in construction too, doesn't he?
He does. He talks about hearing microaggressions on job sites, the casual jokes that aren't actually jokes at all.
He calls it the careless power of words.
Exactly. And the leadership lesson he draws from that is that you have to be awake to it. You have to recognize that a joke isn't just a joke if it reinforces a system that says some people belong and others don't. If you laugh along, you are holding the erasure.
If you laugh, you're holding the erasure. Man, that really sticks with you. And I think this brings us to the biggest system of all, which is history itself. Dantes has a source titled When Revolutions Become Mirages, and he goes really deep into the histories of Cuba and Venezuela.
This is where he puts on his historian hat. And being the son of Cuban parents, this analysis is deeply personal for him too. He talks about the death of Fidel Castro and the capture of political figures like Maduro.
And you'd think he'd be celebrating, right? Like, the tyrant is gone, the bad guy is defeated. But his take is much, much more cautious. He doesn't seem to think simply changing the leader fixes the underlying problem.
No, because of what he calls the cycle of dependency. Dantes argues that if you just swap out the leader, say replace the Castro with someone else entirely, but the people are still completely dependent on the state for their survival, nothing actually changes. You've just changed the hood ornament on the same broken car.
I think he calls it a revolution for the patriarch.
Right. It's this ingrained idea that we are always looking for a savior, a sort of political father figure to fix everything. But true, lasting change doesn't come from just toppling a statue in the square. It comes from the citizens doing the hard work of rebuilding their own integrity, their education, and their absolute independence.
So if the people remain stuck waiting for a savior to rescue them, they'll inevitably just get another dictator.
Precisely. And that ties right back to the mirror concept we started with. You can't fix the country if you don't fix the citizen. If the citizen doesn't practice that radical personal accountability, the state is always going to be broken.
And in his piece titled, When Beliefs Collide, he warns against the us versus them trap in this exact context. He sees modern politics becoming a battleground rather than an actual conversation.
He mentions the deep tension between strict party loyalty and the actual duty to constituents. And his proposed solution is exposure. He says you have to intentionally expose yourself to opposing views.
Which is painful. Nobody wants to do that.
It is deeply painful. But if you only ever listen to your own team, you just become an ideologue. You stop thinking critically. You stop looking in the mirror and you start projecting all over again.
Okay, so we've gone from the factory floor to national politics to international revolutions. But Dantes brings it all the way back down into the living room, into the most intimate parts of human life.
The true spark. This is such a beautiful piece of writing, and honestly, it's where his whole philosophy becomes the most tangible for me.
It really is. He has this vivid, specific image of a father coming home from a long day of work. He's got cement caked on his boots. He smells heavily of welding fumes. He is just absolutely exhausted. But he walks to the door, and the first thing he does is kiss his wife.
And Dantes uses that incredibly grounded moment to dismantle our modern myths about desire. We're constantly told that desire is about performance or having perfect bodies or following these rigid gender scripts.
The shiny Hollywood version of romance.
Exactly. But Dantes says, no. True desire is attention and honesty. It's the act of showing up even when you are completely depleted.
It's the simple acknowledgement of the other person.
It's looking at your partner, seeing the sheer fatigue in their eyes, and silently saying, I see you. Just like the mirror in the workplace, you have to really look at and see the actual person standing in front of you.
He creates this sort of domestic philosophy. It's not about grand, sweeping, romantic gestures. It's about the mundane, everyday rituals of partnership.
Which is entirely consistent with his view on leadership, if you think about it. True leadership isn't the big, inspiring speech on a stage. It's the daily stewardship. It's the consistency of showing up for your people, even when you're covered in cement dust.
Now, before we wrap up today, there's one modern twist in his work that I found fascinating, especially given everything we've talked about. We're sitting here talking about deep human connection, right? We're talking about souls and mirrors and dirt under your fingernails. But Dantes openly admits to using AI to help produce his content.
He does. He addresses this head on in the Authenticity in the Age of AI source, operating under Vision Leon LLC.
It seems like a massive contradiction at first. A resilient philosopher relying on robots. Shouldn't he be writing his essays with a quill pen by candlelight?
You would definitely think so. But you have to look at how he actually uses it. He uses AI for structure, for organizing his thoughts, for the heavy lifting of editing. But he absolutely insists on keeping the cracks and stumbles in his final audio. He keeps his natural accent. He refuses to polish the final product to some artificial perfection.
So he essentially uses the tool to build the house, but he insists on living in it himself.
Exactly. He says technology should always be a tool for stewardship, not a replacement for the human soul. He's showing us in real time that you can engage with modern systems without being consumed by them. You can use the tool, but you must remain the architect of reality.
Architect of Reality. That's the title of his book, isn't it?
It is, and it's such a fitting title for literally everything we've discussed today.
So let's zoom out as we finish up. What does this all really mean for you, the listener? For the person who is just trying to get through their work week without losing their mind?
I think the main synthesis here is that we are all architects. Whether you are standing on a factory floor dealing with a messy shift change, or you're standing in a voting booth deciding on the future of your country, or you're just dog-tired at the end of the day trying to genuinely connect with your spouse.
You have to look in the mirror first.
You have to look in the mirror. You have to constantly ask yourself, am I projecting my own frustration onto this situation, or am I reflecting on my actual contribution to it? Am I serving the people around me, or am I just hoarding power to protect my ego?
And that brings us perfectly back to his core mantra. Always show up for yourself.
And now we truly understand what he means by that. It is not selfishness. It's the absolute prerequisite for serving others. You cannot help anyone else if you haven't done the hard work on yourself first.
You can't pour from an empty cup, and you definitely can't clean a window with dirty hands.
That's exactly it.
We've covered a ton of ground today, from the psychological safety of blame to the massive cycles of history. But I want to leave you, the listener, with a thought that really stuck with me from Dante's work on silence.
Go for it.
We talked earlier about how silence, whether that's withholding encouragement from a child or staying quiet when someone's culture is being erased, how that silence can permanently shape a destiny. Dantes argues that silence in the face of injustice makes you entirely complicit.
It does. It just cements the status quo.
So here is the question for you to mull over until our next deep dive. Where in your own life are you currently staying silent just to stay comfortable? And what is that silence building or destroying for your future?
That is the question.
Thanks for diving deep with us today. We will see you in the next one.